Welcome to my garden, the GinGee GoodEarth program. Your host, Gretchen Schmidt. I'd like to begin the program with one of the best loved poems of America. It's about the springtime, and it's about God. The years at the spring, the years at the spring, and the days at the morn. Mornings at 7, the hillsides dew pearled, the larks on the wing, the snails on the thorn. God's in his heaven, all right with the world. Robert Browning. He's a very famous poet. I will read on the 4th of July the Star-Spangled Banner. So we'll save that big poem for later. And Confucius. Life is really simple, but we insist on making it complicated. That's a great thought of the day. And I want to start to read the United States of America on page 37. We're going to get through this 800-page book probably by July 1st. And I'm going to open the letter that I had written on the day that the Challenger spaceship crash of 1986. And I wrote a letter to a girlfriend that was very involved, as so many people were investors on the Challenger mission. And in 1986, the spacecraft had crashed back onto Earth, and we all had watched that horrific event. So I'm going to open that letter up at the end of this reading. So let's get started, and I welcome you today. And let's all feel a great rejoice because the SpaceX Dragon had a successful takeoff. And we all watched that on the NASA YouTube channel. But without further ado, let me begin. The succeeding winter commenced in December with the great severity. Few of the houses with which had been erected were comfortable. This is in Plymouth. Salem. This is Salem. They're talking about Salem. In the succeeding winter, commenced in December, with the great severity, few of the houses which I'm just checking here, had been erected were comfortable. Unused to such severities of climate, the people suffered severely from the cold. Many of them died from the cold. On the opening of the spring of 1631, health was generally restored in the settlements, but the colony was greatly impoverished. All the provisions that were brought from England were purchased at a very high rate. By the length of the passage and the severity of the winter, the greater part of their cattle died. The materials for building, the implements of labor, were obtained with great difficulty and expense. This year, great exertions were made for a crop of Indian corn, which was their whole dependence, and it pleased God to give them an abundant harvest. In the commencement of all the individual settlements, the planters were mindful of their great errand into the wilderness, and directed their first exertions to the establishment of the Church of Christ, and the institution of the gospel. The gospel is a great book of moral lessons and reviews the history of humanity. and how God had called upon the people to do his will. The first church after the one at Salem was gathered at Charleston, August 27, 1630. Soon after this, a church was organized at Dorchester. The next was at Boston, was organized, one at Roxbury, one at Lynn, and one at Watertown. In less than 2 years from the organization of the first church in Salem, there were in the colony 7 churches, which were indeed golden candlesticks. In 1633 came over Mr. Haynes, afterwards the first governor of Connecticut, and Mr. Stone, and Mr. Duker, and I bet you Mr. Cotton. 3 of the most eminent lights of the New England churches. On the 21st of February, an order was made by the king and council to stop the ships at that time ready to sail, frightened with passengers and provisions for New England. But this order seems never to have been strictly executed, as the immigration still continued without any sensible diminution. Let me now call the attention of the reader to the settlement of Connecticut. The first discovery of the country of Connecticut River was made by the enterprising people of Plymouth in 1633. The Plymouth people determined to undertake the enterprise at their own risk. Preparations were made for creating a trading house and establishing a small company upon the river. In the meantime, the master of a vessel or ship from Massachusetts, who was trading at New Netherlands, showed to the Dutch governor the commission the English had to trade and settle in New England, and that the king had granted these parts to his own subjects. He also desired that the Dutch would not build in Connecticut. The Dutch governor requested that the English would not settle in Connecticut until the affair should be determined between them. This appears to have been a piece of policy in the Dutch governor, to keep the English back until the Dutch had got a firm footing upon the river. In September, several vessels went into Connecticut River to trade. John Odham from Dorchester with a few men traveled through Connecticut to view the country and trade with the Indians. He found that the Indian hemp grew in great abundance in the meadows, and purchased a quantity of it, which upon trial was found to exceed that which grew in England. William Holmes of Plymouth, with his company, having prepared the frame of a house and boards and materials for covering it, immediately put them on board a vessel and sailed for Connecticut. When he came into the river, he found that the Dutch had got in before him, and made a light fort, and planted 2 pieces of cannon at the mouth of the little river since called Hartford. The Dutch forbade Holmes going up the river, stood by their cannon, and ordered him to strike his colors, or they would fire upon him. But he was a man of spirit, and assured them that he had a commission from the governor of Plymouth to go up the river. And go he would. They still threatened, but he proceeded, landed on the west side of the river, and erected his house a little below the mouth of the little river in Windsor. This was the first house erected in Connecticut. He was covered with the utmost dispatch and well fortified. The Senchums, who were originally the owners of the soil, had been driven from this point of the country by the Pequots, and were now carried home on board Holmes' vessel. The Dutch, about the same time, erected a trading house at Hartford. It was with great difficulty that Holmes and his company erected and fortified their house, and kept it afterwards. The Dutch, before the Plymouth people took possession of the river, had been invited to trade with them at the Connecticut, but when they found that they were preparing for settlement there, they repented of the invitation and did all in their power to prevent them. On the 8th of June, the Dutch purchased about 20 acres of land at Hartford of the Pequod captain. Of this, the Dutch looked possession. They protested against Holmes, the builder of trading house. Sometimes afterwards, the Dutch governor dispatched a reinforcement from the fort at Amsterdam to Connecticut, designing to drive Holmes and his company from the river. A band of 70 men assaulted the Plymouth house, but they found it too well fortified and gave up on their design. In November and December, the smallpox raged among the Indians. 2 Sachins, with a great part of their Indians, died. When their own people forsook them, the English who lived near them went to their wigwams and administered to them. Some families spent almost their whole time with them. One Englishman buried 30 of their dead in one day. In 1634, at a meeting of the General Court in September, the people of Newton made application for liberty to remove to Connecticut River. Mr. Hooker, so it was Hooker, not Dooker. The book is very old and stained, so it's hard to see the lettering. I have to use a flashlight. Acting as principal advocate for the people, the court refused to give their consent, and the design was given over. In 1635, permission was granted on condition that the new settlement should continue subject to the jurisdiction of Massachusetts. The people of Newton, Dorchester, Watertown now began to prepare for their new habitation. In the course of the season, several people went to Connecticut River, some by water, some through the wilderness. The Dorchester men sat down at Windsor, near Plymouth Trading House. They purchased the building and land owned by the Plymouth people. The people from Newton, of whom but few removed till the following year, settled at Hartford. The Watertown settlers began the town of Wethersfield. In 1636, about 100 persons, men, women, and children, led by Reverend Monsieur Hooker and Stone, together with their horses, cattle, and swine, commenced their journey through the wilderness to the Connecticut River. They traveled about 2 weeks on foot, during which time they lived upon the milk of their cows. I'll take a break, and now I'm going to open the letter. So, I have to get my studio here better arranged. I'm sitting on a bench and it gets very uncomfortable, and I'm trying to talk into the video camera and my back starts killing me while I'm reading, and then I have to stop. So that I apologize, but I will be able to read longer if I have a comfortable chair and setup. But if I have to sit right next to the video camera, it makes it awful hard. So I'm opening up the letter. Here's the back of the letter. So it has a little teacup. I was real big on teaism, and I taught how to prepare tea, and I had tea parties, and I had a really great party in Brookfield, Pennsylvania, the most Victorian town in America. So I'm going to open up the letter, and let's see what's in it. Let's see if I ripped off the teacup. So here's the letter, okay, and her name was Lori, and she knew the Rockwells, and the Rockwells were very much affiliated with NASA space programs, and I knew the Rockwells while I was growing up in Pittsburgh, and they had a home near Seven Springs Resort. It was a ski resort, and we knew the family very well, and they had a helicopter landing pad at their cabin near Seven Springs, And they would always have Christmas in July, and they'd bring Santa Claus by helicopter to meet all the neighborhood children from the country farms. And she also knew the Rockwells. And we talked about the disaster of the Challenger spaceflight program. So let's see what I wrote to her. It was a long ago. Well, first of all, I gave her a flyer. I had a store named Rosemary's Garden House at Herbs and Spices. And I gave her a flyer on how to make a perfect cup of tea and how to make Italian herb vinegar. And there's a cartoon there, herb garden, parsley, sage, rosemary was the woman who managed the garden and thyme. And then I featured different herbs and I wrote about them, and I had a book. And I also printed a holiday newsletter back in 1997, so that really dates me. And I used to sell Christmas tea and Lenox glass Christmas ornaments, and I used to paint oyster shells with Santa Claus and poinsettias. And I used to have a Christmas basket collection that I'd put together a Christmas basket for sale, and I sold Carnegie Christmas tea and Whirlpool Christmas tea and Henry Clay Frick tea, and just an abundance of Pittsburgh variety teas. And so I had, teas and tisanes from all over the world. And this was my tea list. This is one of them. I had Canadian blackcurrant because I love blackcurrant. But I had the Albrandt Carnegie Frick Oliver tea. So that was important. And I lived on Fripp Island in Beaufort, South Carolina. And then I had Arizona Orange Blossom, and I did swim for Arizona State University. I had Rose Nectar tea, and then I had Pittsburgh Hospitality. And I am a climate leader, and one of the fun things that I did with the Climate Reality Project was I said that climate reality, so that came from my teaism programs, that climate is a reality. And so I gave her some tea bags. And it says, Dear Lori, in regards to some historical information on the Rockwells, according to my mother, again, our family owned a residence at Seven Springs since 1955, when it used to be called Six Springs. And then they marketed a better name, and they found another spring. But there's springs all through the mountains of southwestern Pennsylvania. The Rockwells owned BassRock near the Alpine Lodge at Seven Springs. Rockwell started making thermostats in his garage. He was an inventor in Pittsburgh. My mother recalls the family as pleasant, including families and children in special events. My parents, again, had 6 children. We were avid skiers, and a family pass at Seven Springs in the 60s was $35. The Rockwells had Christmas in July and invited everyone to BassRock for a helicopter landing, and Santa Claus came with treats for the children. It was my first time to see a helicopter. There were markings and small lights for the landing pad. I recall walking around their lake near their home. I thought you might enjoy this information. You probably can inquire. Thank you for your pleasant conversation at Ohiopyle, Pennsylvania. It was a day for me to get away. Kindest regards, Gretchen. And her family had investments with 84 Lumber, and 84 Lumber bought the property that her family lost, due to the fact of the Challenger crashing. So those investors that invested in the space missions went bankrupt, and she was one family that went bankrupt because of the Challenger failure in 1986, and then they had sold all their property to 84 Lumber in southwestern Pennsylvania. And so that's just something, I had no idea what was in that letter. It's been so long, but that's kind of fun, because we have to remember, we're all part of the makeup of a community, of a borough, of a city, of a township, and we have to get to know our neighbors. And one way that everybody would get to know everybody was the fact that I've seen murals on this. You walk into a building and they show you how people congregate. First comes family, then church, then work, and there's murals on the history of people. So therefore, if you were a family that were farmers, you could see murals with the farming family and the barn and the farmhouse. And then you had your agricultural crops, your cash crops being wheat and corn and barley. And then you had your church. And there's different denominations of church. And depending on what part of Europe you came from, and then that's what made America great, was that you had the freedom of religion. And so this is part of the makeup of the melting pot of people that came from Europe to America, that helped build and make America. And also, you were free to be an inventor, or you were free to own a business, and women too. So again, a lot of great history, but I'm glad I got to share that with you. Okay, listen, I want you to enjoy the day, watch the programs on spaceflight with NASA on the internet, and enjoy the day. And we did have a successful mission. Let's pray that our astronauts are kept safe in flight and they return home safe. And I think their first stop is the International Space Station. And I did see a flyover of the International Space Station. And where I saw that was at Deer Lakes Park in southwest Pennsylvania. They have an observatory and high-powered telescopes. And it was wonderful because I got to see the International Space Station with my own eyes. I didn't need binoculars, I didn't need a telescope, and I saw the flyover because the astronomy instructor, had it perfectly timed when we could look up in the night sky and see the International Space Station fly over. And we were very fortunate because a mirror had a reflection from the sun, and so we saw the space station as bright as can be, all in its entirety, because it reflected the sun and it brightened up the craft, and you could see everything, and it was a wonderful experience. So that's where the astronauts are heading first, and I hope they have a successful docking, transfer to that spacecraft, and then upon their return, they have a safe return back to Earth. So very exciting. I think science and astronomy and space is so important to have our brains activated by the wonders of the earth and the heavens. And again, let's end the program and have a great day.